The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Volume 1, Cosmogenesis. Book 1, Part 3, Science and the Secret Doctrine Contrasted. Addenda to Book 1. Addenda Chapter 10, The Coming Force, Its Possibilities and Impossibilities. Shall we say that force is moving matter or matter in motion, and a manifestation of energy, or that matter and force are the phenomenal differentiated aspects of the one primary undifferentiated cosmic substance? This query is made with regard to that stanza which treats of Forhat and his 7 brothers or sons. In other words, of the cause and the effects of cosmic electricity, the latter called, in occult parlance, the 7 primary forces of electricity, whose purely phenomenal, and hence grossest effects, are alone cognizable by physicists on the cosmic, and especially on the terrestrial plane. These include, among other things, sound, light, color, etc., etc. Now what does physical science tell us of these, quote, forces, unquote? Sound, it says, is a sensation produced by the impact of atmospheric molecules on the tympanum, which, by setting up delicate tremors in the auditory apparatus, thus communicate themselves to the brain. Light is the sensation caused by the impact of inconceivably minute vibrations of ether on the retina of the eye. So too we say, but this is simply the effect produced in our atmosphere and its immediate surroundings, all in fact which falls within the range of our terrestrial consciousness. Jupiter Pluvius sent his symbol in drops of rain, or water composed, as is believed, of 2 elements, which chemistry dissociates and recombines. The compound molecules are in its power, but their atoms still elude its grasp. Occultism sees in all these forces and manifestations a ladder, the lower rungs of which belong to exoteric physics, and the higher are traced to a living, intelligent, invisible power which is, as a rule, the unconcerned and exceptionally the conscious cause of the sense-born phenomenon designated as this or another natural law. We say and maintain that sound, for one thing, is a tremendous occult power, that it is a stupendous force, of which the electricity generated by 1,000,000 of Niagaras could never counteract the smallest potentiality when directed with occult knowledge. Sound may be produced of such a nature that the pyramid of Cheops would be raised in the air, or that a dying man, nay, one at his last breath, would be revived and filled with new energy and vigor. For sound generates, or rather attracts together, the elements that produce an ozone, the fabrication of which is beyond chemistry, but within the limits of alchemy. It may even resurrect a man or an animal whose astral, vital body has not been irreparably separated from the physical body by the severance of the magnetic or odic cord. As one saved thrice from death by that power, the writer ought to be credited with knowing personally something about it. And if all this appears too unscientific to be even noticed, let science explain to what mechanical and physical laws known to it is due to the recently produced phenomena of the so-called Keely motor. What is it that acts as the formidable generator of invisible but tremendous force, of that power which is not only capable of driving an engine of 25 horsepower, but has even been employed to lift the machinery bodily? Yet this is done simply by drawing a fiddle bow across a tuning fork, and has been repeatedly proven. For the etheric force, discovered by the well-known, in America and now in Europe, Ernst Worrell Keely of Philadelphia, is no hallucination. Notwithstanding his failure to utilize it, a failure prognosticated and maintained by some occultists from the first, the phenomena exhibited by the discoverer during the last few years have been wonderful, almost miraculous, not in the sense of the supernatural, but of the superhuman. Note: the word supernatural implies above or outside of nature. Nature and space are one. Now, space for the metaphysician exists outside of any active sensation, and is a purely subjective representation. Materialism, which would connect it forcibly with one or the other datum of sensation notwithstanding. For our senses, it is fairly subjective when independent of anything within it. How then can any phenomenon or anything else step outside of or be performed beyond that which has no limits? But when spatial extension becomes simply conceptual and is thought of in an idea connected with certain actions, as by the materialists and the physicists, then again they have hardly a right to define and claim that which can or cannot be produced by forces generated within even limited spaces, as they have not even an approximate idea of what those forces are. End of note. Had Keely been permitted to succeed, he might have reduced a whole army to atoms in the space of a few seconds, as easily as he reduced a dead ox to the same condition. The reader is now asked to give a serious attention to that newly discovered potency which the discoverer has named inter-etheric force and forces. In the humble opinion of the occultists, as of his immediate friends, Mr. Keely of Philadelphia was, and still is, at the threshold of some of the greatest secrets of the universe, of that chiefly on which is built the whole mystery of physical forces and the esoteric significance of the mundane egg symbolism. Occult philosophy, viewing the manifested and the unmanifested cosmos as a unity, symbolizes the ideal conception of the former by that golden egg with two poles in it. It is the positive pole that acts in the manifested world of matter, while the negative is lost in the unknowable absoluteness of Sat, beingness. Note, quote, "It is not correct when speaking of idealism to show it based upon the old ontological assumptions that things or entities exist independently of each other, and otherwise than as terms of relations," unquote, says Stallo. At any rate, it is incorrect to say so of idealism in Eastern philosophy and its cognition, for it is just the reverse. End of note. Whether this agrees with the philosophy of Mr. Keely we cannot tell, nor does it really much matter. Nevertheless, his ideas about the ethereal material construction of the universe look strangely like our own, being in this respect nearly identical. This is what we find him saying in an able pamphlet compiled by Mrs. Bloomfield Moore, an American lady of wealth and position, whose incessant efforts in the pursuit of truth can never be too highly appreciated. Quote, Mr. Keely, in explanation of the working of his engine, says, "In the conception of any machine heretofore constructed, the medium for inducing a neutral center has never been found. If it had, the difficulties of a perpetual motion seekers would have ended, and this problem would have become an established and operating fact. It would only require an introductory impulse of a few pounds on such a device to cause it to run for centuries. In the conception of my vibratory engine, I did not seek to attain perpetual motion, but a circuit is formed that actually has a neutral center, which is in a condition to be vivified by my vibratory ether, and, while under operation by said substance, is really a machine that is virtually independent of the mass, or globe. And it is the wonderful velocity of the vibratory circuit which makes it so. Still, with all its perfection, it requires to be fed with the vibratory ether to make it an independent motor. Note. Independent in a certain sense, but not disconnected with it. End of note. Further, all structures require foundation in strength according to the weight of the mass they have to carry. But the foundations of the universe rest on a vacuous point far more minute than a molecule. In fact, to express this truth properly, on an inter-etheric point, which requires an infinite mind to understand it. To look down into the depths of an etheric center is precisely the same as it would be to search into the broad space of heaven's ether to find the end, with this difference, that one is the positive field, while the other is the negative field." Unquote. This, as easily seen, is precisely the Eastern doctrine. His interetheric point is the Laya point of the occultists, which, however, does not require an infinite mind to understand it, but only specific intuition and ability to trace its hiding place in this world of matter. Of course, the Laya center cannot be produced, but an interetheric vacuum can, as proved in the production of the bell sounds in space. Mr. Keely speaks as an unconscious occultist, nevertheless, when he remarks in his theory of planetary suspension, quote, "As regards planetary volume, we should ask in a scientific point of view, how can the immense difference of volume in the planets exist without disorganizing the harmonious action that has always characterized them? I can only answer this question properly by entering into a progressive analysis, starting on the rotating etheric centers that were fixed by the Creator with their attractive or accumulative power." Note: by Fohat more likely than the Creator would be an occultist's reply. End of note. If you ask what power it is that gives to each etheric atom its inconceivable velocity of rotation or introductory impulse, I must answer that no finite mind will ever be able to conceive what it is. The philosophy of accumulation is the only proof that such a power has been given. The area, if we can so speak, of such an atom presents to the attractive or magnetic, the elective or propulsive, or the receptive force, and all the antagonistic force that characterizes a planet of the largest magnitude. Consequently, as the accumulation goes on, the perfect equation remains the same. When this minute center has once been fixed, the power to rend it from its position would necessarily have to be so great as to displace the most immense planet that exists. When this atomic neutral center is displaced, the planet must go with it. The neutral center carries the full load of any accumulation from the start and remains the same, forever balanced in the eternal space." Unquote. Mr. Keely illustrates his idea of a neutral center in this way. Quote, "We will imagine that, after an accumulation of a planet of any diameter, say 20,000 miles more or less, for the size has nothing to do with the problem, there should be a displacement of all the material, with exception of a crust 5,000 miles thick, leaving an intervening void between this crust and a center of the size of an ordinary billiard ball. It would then require force as great to move this small central mass as it would to move the shell of 5,000 miles thickness. Moreover, this small central mass would carry the load of this crust forever, keeping it equidistant, and there could be no opposing power, however great, that could bring them together. The imagination staggers in contemplating the immense load which bears upon this point of center, where weight ceases. This is what we understand by a neutral center." Unquote. And what occultists understand by a Laya center. The above is pronounced unscientific by many, but so is everything that is not sanctioned and kept on strictly orthodox lines by physical science. Unless the explanation given by the inventor himself is accepted, and his explanations being, as observed, quite orthodox from the spiritual and the occult standpoints, if not from that of the materialistic speculative called exact science, are therefore ours in this particular. What can science answer to facts already seen which it is no longer possible for anyone to deny? Occult philosophy divulges few of its most important vital mysteries. It drops them like precious pearls one by one, far and wide apart, and only when forced to do so by the evolutionary tidal wave that carries on humanity slowly, silently, but steadily toward the dawn of the sixth race mankind. For once out of the safe custody of their legitimate heirs and keepers, those mysteries cease to be occult. They fall into the public domain and have to run the risk of becoming in the hands of the selfish, of the Cains of the human race, curses more often than blessings. Nevertheless, whenever such individuals as the discoverer of etheric force, Ernst Worrell Keely, men with peculiar psychic and mental capacities, are born, They are generally and more frequently helped than allowed to go unassisted, groping on their way, though, if left to their own resources, falling very soon victims to martyrdom and unscrupulous speculators. Only they are helped on the condition that they should not become, whether consciously or unconsciously, as additional peril to their age, a danger to the poor, now offered in daily holocaust by the less wealthy to the very. This necessitates a short digression and an explanation. Notes. Note on men with peculiar psychic and mental capacities. The reason for such psychic capacities is given farther on. End of note. Note on the helping of such individuals, etc. The above was written 2 years ago, at a time when hopes of success for the Keely motor were at their highest. What was then said by the writer proved true in every word, and now only few remarks are added to it with regard to the failure of his expectations, so far which has now been admitted by the discoverer himself. Though, however, the word failure is here used, the reader should understand it in a relative sense, for, as Mrs. Bloomfield Moore explains, what Mr. Keely does not admit is that, baffled in applying vibratory force to mechanics, up in his first and second lines of experimental research, he was obliged either to confess a commercial failure or to try a third departure from his base or principle, seeking success through another channel, she explained. And this channel is on the physical plane. End of note. Some 12 years back, during the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, the writer, in answering the earnest queries of a theosophist, one of the earliest admirers of Mr. Keely, repeated to him what she had heard in quarters, information from which she could never doubt. It had been stated that the inventor of the self-motor was what is called, in the jargon of the Kabbalists, a natural-born magician, that he was and would remain unconscious of the full range of his powers, and would work out merely those which he had found out and ascertained in his own nature, firstly, because attributing them to a wrong source, he could never give them full sway, and secondly, because it was beyond his power to pass to others that which was a capacity inherent in his special nature. Hence the whole secret could not be made over permanently to anyone for practical purposes or use. Note. We learn that these remarks are not applicable to Mr. Keely's latest discovery. Time alone can show the exact limit of his achievements. End of note. Individuals born with such a capacity are not very rare. That they are not heard of more frequently is due to the fact that they live and die in almost every case in utter ignorance of being possessed of abnormal powers at all. Mr. Keely possesses powers which are called abnormal, just because they happen in our day to be as little known as blood circulation was before harvest time. Blood existed, and it behaved as it does at present in the first man born from woman, and so does that principle in man which can control and guide etheric vibratory force. At any rate, it exists in all those mortals whose inner selves are primordially connected by reason of their direct descent with that group of Jankochans who are called the firstborn of ether. Mankind, physically considered, is divided into varied groups, each of which is connected with one of the Dianic groups that first formed psychic man. See paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the commentary to stanza 7. Mr. Keely, being greatly favored in this respect, and moreover, besides his psychic temperament, being intellectually a genius in mechanics, may thus achieve most wonderful results. He has achieved some already, more than any mortal man not initiated into the final mysteries has achieved in this age up to this present day. What he has done is certainly quite sufficient to demolish with the hammer of science the idols of science, the idols of matter with the feet of clay, as his friends justly predict and say of him. Nor would the writer for a moment think of contradicting Mrs. Bloomfield Moore when in her paper on psychic force and etheric force she states that Mr. Keely, as a philosopher, is great enough in soul, wise enough in mind, and sublime enough in courage to overcome all difficulties and to stand at last before the world as the greatest discoverer and inventor in the world. And again she writes, quote, should Keely do no more than lead scientists from the dreary realms where they are groping into the open field of elemental force, where gravity and cohesion are disturbed in their haunts and diverted to use, where, from unity to origin, emanates infinite energy in diversified forms, he will achieve immortal fame. Should he demonstrate to the destruction of materialism that the universe is animated by a mysterious principle to which matter, however perfectly organized, is absolutely subservient, he will be a greater spiritual benefactor to our race than the modern world has yet found in any man. Should he be able to substitute, in the treatment of disease, the finer forces of nature for the grossly material agencies which have sent more human beings to their graves than war, pestilence, and famine combined, he will merit and receive the gratitude of mankind. All this and more will he do, if he and those who have watched his progress day by day for years are not too sanguine in their expectations." Unquote. Writing in the TPS, Theosophical Publication Society, Series number 9, the same lady in a pamphlet, Keely's Secrets, bring forward a passage from an article written a few years ago by the writer of the present volume in her journal The Theosophist, in these words. Quote, "The author of number 5 of the pamphlets issued by the Theosophical Publication Society, What is Matter and What is Force, says therein, the men of science have just found out a fourth state of matter, whereas the occultists have penetrated years ago beyond the sixth, and therefore do not infer, but know of, the existence of the seventh, the last. This knowledge comprises one of the secrets of Keely's so-called compound secret. It is already known to many that his secret includes the augmentation of energy, the insulation of the ether, and the adaptation of dynaspheric force to machinery." Unquote. It is just because Keely's discovery would lead to a knowledge of one of the most occult secrets, a secret which can never be allowed to fall into the hands of the masses, that his failure to push his discoveries to their logical end seems certain to occultists. But of this more presently. Even in its limitations, this discovery may prove of the greatest benefit, for, quote, "step by step, with the patient perseverance which some day the world will honor, this man of genius has made his researches, overcoming the colossal difficulties which again and again raised up in his path what seemed to be, to all but himself, insurmountable barriers to further progress. But never has the world's index finger so pointed to an hour when all is making ready for the advent of the new form of force that mankind is waiting for. Nature, always reluctant to yield her secrets, is listening to the demands made upon her by her master, necessity. The coal mines of the world cannot longer afford the increasing drain made upon them. Steam has reached its utmost limits of power and does not fulfill the requirements of the age. It knows that its days are numbered. Electricity holds back with bated breath, dependent upon the approach of her sister colleague. Airships are riding at anchor, as it were, waiting for the force which is to make aerial navigation something more than a dream. As easily as men communicate with their offices from their homes by means of the telephone, so will the inhabitants of separate continents talk across the ocean. Imagination is palsied when seeking to foresee the grand results of this marvelous discovery when once it is applied to art and mechanics. In taking the throne which it will force steam to abdicate, dynaspheric force will rule the world with a power so mighty in the interests of civilization that no finite mind can conjecture the results. Lawrence Oliphant, in his preface to Scientific Religion, says, "A new moral future is dawning upon the human race, one, certainly, of which it stands much in need. In no way could this new moral future be so widely, so universally commenced as by the utilizing of dynaspheric force to the beneficial purposes in life." Unquote. The occultists are ready to admit all this with the eloquent writer. Molecular vibration is undeniably Keely's legitimate field of research, and the discoveries made by him will prove wonderful, yet only in his hands and through himself. The world so far will get that which it can be safely entrusted. The truth of this assertion has, perhaps, not yet quite dawned upon the discoverer himself, since he writes that he is absolutely certain that he will accomplish all that he has promised, and will then give it out to the world. But it must dawn upon him, and at no very far distant date, and that, he says, in reference to his work, is a good proof of it. Quote, "In considering the operation of my engine, the visitor, in order to have even an approximate conception of its modus operandi, must discard all thought of engines that are operated upon the principle of pressure and exhaustion, by the expansion of steam or other analogous gas, which impinges upon an abutment, such as the piston of a steam engine. My engine has neither piston nor eccentrics, nor is there one grain of pressure exerted in the engine, whatever may be the size or capacity of it. My system, in every part and detail, both in the developing of my power and in every branch of its utilization, is based and founded on sympathetic vibration. In no other way would it be possible to awaken or develop my force, and equally impossible would it be to operate my engine upon any other principle. This, however, is the true system, and henceforth all my operations will be conducted in this manner. That is to say, my power will be generated, my engines run, my cannon operated, through a wire." It has been only after years of incessant labor and the making of almost innumerable experiments involving not only the construction of a great many most peculiar mechanical structures and the closest investigation and study of the phenomenal properties of the substance ether per se produced, that I have been able to dispense with complicated mechanism and to obtain, as I claim, mastery over the subtle and strange force with which I am dealing." Unquote. The passages underlined by us are those which bear directly on the occult side of the application of the vibratory force, or what Mr. Keely calls sympathetic vibration. The Y is already a step below, or downward from the pure etheric plane into the terrestrial. The discoverer has produced marvels. The word miracle is not too strong. When acting through the inter-etheric force alone, the fifth and sixth principles of Akasha. From a, quote, generator, unquote, 6 feet long, he has come down to one no larger than an old-fashioned silver watch. And this by itself is a miracle of mechanical but not spiritual genius. But, as well expressed by his great patroness and defender, Mrs. Bloomfield Moore, the two forms of force which he has been experimenting with, and phenomena attending them, are the very antithesis of each other. One was generated and acted upon by, and through, himself. No one who should have repeated the thing done by himself could have produced the same results. It was Keely's ether that acted truly, while Smith's or Brown's ether would have remained forever barren of results. For Keely's difficulty has hitherto been to produce a machine which would develop and regulate the, quote, force, unquote, without the intervention of any willpower or personal influence, whether conscious or unconscious, of the operator. In this he has failed, so far as others were concerned, for no one but himself could operate on his machines. Occultly, this was a far more advanced achievement than the, quote, success, unquote, which he anticipates from his wire. But the results obtained from the fifth and sixth planes of the etheric or astral force will never be permitted to serve purposes of commerce and traffic. That Keely's organism is directly connected with the production of the marvelous results is proven by the following statement, emanating from one who knows the great discoverer intimately. At one time, the shareholders of the Keely Motor Company put a man in his workshop for the express purpose of discovering his secret. After 6 months of close watching, he said to J.W. Keely one day, "I know how it is done now." They had been setting up a machine together, and Keely was manipulating the stopcock, which turned the force on and off. "Well, try it then," was the answer. The man turned the cock, and nothing came. "Let me see you do it again," the man said to Keely. The latter complied, and the machinery operated at once. Again the other tried, but without success. Then Keely put his hand on his shoulder and told him to try once more. He did so with the result of an instantaneous production of the current. This fact, if true, settles the question. We are told that Mr. Keely defines electricity as a certain form of atomic vibration. In this he is quite right. But this is electricity on the terrestrial plane, and through terrestrial correlations he estimates molecular vibrations at 100 million per second, intermolecular 300 million per second, atomic vibrations at 9 million per second, interatomic vibrations at 2,700,000,000 per second, etheric vibrations at 8,100,000,000 per second, interetheric vibrations at 24,300,000,000 per second. This proves our point. There are no vibrations that could be counted or even estimated at an approximate rate beyond the realm of the fourth son of Fohat, using an occult phraseology, or that motion which corresponds to the formation of Mr. Crookes' radiant matter, or lightly called some years ago the fourth state of matter, on this our plane. If the question is asked why Mr. Keely was not allowed to pass a certain limit, the answer is easy. Because that which he has unconsciously discovered is the terrible sidereal force known to and named by the Atlanteans Mashmak, and by the Aryan Rishis in their Ashtavidya by a name that we do not like to give. It is the vril of Bulvolitan's coming race, and of the coming races of our mankind. The name vril may be a fiction. The force itself is a fact doubted as little in India as the existence itself of the Rishis, since it is mentioned in all the secret works. It is this vibratory force which, when aimed at an army from an Agni Rath fixed on a flying vessel, a balloon, according to the instructions found in Ashtavidya, reduced to ashes 100,000 men and elephants, as easily as it would a dead rat. It is allegorized in the Vishnu Purana, in the Ramayana and other works, in the fable about the sage Kapila, whose glance made a mountain of ashes of King Sagara's 60,000 sons, and which is explained in the esoteric works and referred to as the Kapilaksha, Kapila's eye. And is it this satanic force that our generations were to be allowed to add to their stock of anarchists, baby toys, melanite, dynamic clockworks, explosive oranges, so-called flower baskets, and such other innocent names? Is it this destructive agency which, once in the hands of some modern Attila, for example a bloodthirsty anarchist, would reduce Europe in a few days to its primitive, chaotic state, with no man left alive to tell the tale? Is this force to become the common property of all men alike? What Mr. Keely has already done is grand and wonderful in the extreme. There is enough work before him in the demonstration of his new system to humble the pride of those scientists who are materialistic by revealing those mysteries which lie behind the world of matter, without revealing it nolens volens to all. For surely psychists and spiritualists, of whom there are a good number in the European armies, would be the first to experience personally the fruits of such mysteries revealed. Thousands of them would find themselves, and perhaps with the populations of whole countries to keep them company, in blue ether very soon, were such a force to be even entirely discovered, let alone made publicly known. The discovery in its completeness is by several thousand, or shall we say 100,000, years too premature. It will be at its appointed place and time only, when the great roaring flood of starvation, misery, and underpaid labor ebbs back again, as it will when happily at last the just demands of the many are attended to, when the proletariat exists but in name, and the pitiful cry for bread that rings throughout the world unheeded has died away. This may be hastened by the spread of learning, and by new openings for work and emigration, with better prospects than exist now, and on some new continent that may appear. then only will Keely's motor and force, as originally contemplated by himself and friends, be in demand, because it will be more needed by the poor than by the wealthy. Meanwhile, the force discovered by him will work through wires, and this, if he succeeds, will be quite sufficient in the present generation to make of him the greatest discoverer of this age. What Mr. Keely says of sound and color is also correct from the occult standpoint. Hear him talk as though he were the nursling of the gods revealers and had gazed all his life into the depths of Father Mother Aether. In comparing the tenuity of the atmosphere with that of the etheric flows obtained by him from his invention for breaking up the molecules of air by vibration, Keely says that, quote, "It is as platina to hydrogen gas. Molecular separation of air brings us to the first subdivision only, intermolecular, to the second atomic, to the third interatomic, to the fourth etheric, to the fifth and interetheric, to the sixth subdivision or positive association, luminiferous ether." Note: this also is the division made by the occultists under other names. End of note. In my introductory argument, I have contended that this is the vibratory envelope of all atoms. In my definition of atom, I do not confine myself to the sixth subdivision, where this luminiferous ether is developed in its crude form, as far as my researches prove. Note: quite so, since there is the seventh beyond, which begins the same enumeration from the first to the last, on another and higher plane. End of note. I think this idea will be pronounced by the physicists of the present day a wild freak of the imagination. Possibly, in time, a light may fall upon this theory that will bring its simplicity forward for scientific research. At present, I can only compare it to some planets in a dark space where the light of the sun of science has not yet reached it. I assume that sound, like odor, is a real substance of unknown and wonderful tenuity, emanating from a body where it has been induced by percussion and throwing out absolute corpuscles of matter, interatomic particles, with velocity of 1,120 feet per second, in vacuo 20,000. The substance which is thus disseminated is a part and parcel of the mass agitated, and if kept under this agitation continuously, would, in the course of a certain cycle of time, become thoroughly absorbed by the atmosphere, or, more truly, would pass through the atmosphere to an elevated point of tenuity corresponding to the condition of subdivision that governs its liberation from its parent body. The sound from vibratory forks, set so as to produce etheric chords, while disseminating their tones compound, permeate most thoroughly all substances that come under the range of the atomic bombardment. The clapping of a bell in vacuo liberates these atoms with the same velocity and volume as one in the open air, and were the agitation of the bell kept up continuously for a few millions of centuries, it would thoroughly return to its primitive element. And if the chamber were hermetically sealed and strong enough, the vacuous volume surrounding the bell would be brought to a pressure of many thousands of pounds to the square inch by the tenuous substance evolved. In my estimation, sound truly defined is the disturbance of atomic equilibrium, rupturing actual atomic corpuscles, and the substance thus liberated must certainly be a certain order of etheric flow. Under these conditions, is it unreasonable to suppose that, if this flow were kept up, and the body thus robbed of its element, it would in time disappear entirely? All bodies are formed primitively from this highly tenuous ether, animal, vegetable, and mineral, and they are only returned to their high gaseous condition when brought under a state of differential equilibrium. As regards odor, we can only get some definite idea of its extreme and wondrous tenuity by taking into consideration that a large area of atmosphere can be impregnated for a long series of years from a single grain of musk, which, if weighed after that long interval, will be found to be not appreciably diminished. The great paradox attending the flow of odorous particles is that they can be held under confinement in a glass vessel. Here is a substance of much higher tenuity than the glass that holds it, and yet it cannot escape. It is as a sieve with its meshes large enough to pass marbles, and yet holding fine sand which cannot pass through. In fact, a molecular vessel holding an atomic substance. This is a problem that would confound those who stop to recognize it. But infinitely tenuous as odor is, it holds a very crude relation to the substance of subdivision that governs a magnetic flow, a flow of sympathy, if you please to call it so. This subdivision comes next to sound, but is above sound. The action of the flow of a magnet coincides somewhat to the receiving and distributing portion of the human brain, giving off at all times a depreciating ratio of the amount received. It is a grand illustration of the control of mind over matter, which gradually depreciates the physical till dissolution takes place. The magnet on the same ratio gradually loses its power and becomes inert. If the relations that exist between mind and matter could be equated and so held, we would live on in our physical state eternally, as there would be no physical depreciation. But this physical depreciation leads, at its terminus, to the source of a much higher development, meaning the liberation of the pure ether from the crude molecular, which, in my estimation, is to be much desired." Unquote. Taken from Mrs. Bloomfield Moore's paper, The New Philosophy. It may be remarked that, save a few small divergences, no adept or alchemist could have explained the above any better in the light of modern science, however much the latter may protest against the novel views. This is, in all its fundamental principles, if not details, occultism pure and simple, yet withal modern natural philosophy as well. This new force, or whatever science may call it, the effects of which are undeniable, admitted by more than one naturalist and physicist who has visited Mr. Keely's laboratory and witnessed personally its tremendous effects. What is it? It is a mode of motion, also in vacuum, since there is no matter to generate it except sound. Another mode of motion, no doubt, a sensation caused, like color, by vibrations. Fully as we believe in these vibrations as the proximate, the immediate cause of such sensations, we as absolutely reject the one-sided scientific theory that there is no factor to be considered as external to us other than etheric or atmospheric vibrations. Note: in this case the American substantialists are not wrong, though too anthropomorphic and material in their views to be accepted by the occultists, when arguing through Mrs. M.S. Organ, M.D., that there must be positive entitative properties in objects which have a constitutional relation to the nerves of animal sensations, or there can be no perception. No impression of any kind can be made upon brain, nerve, or mind, no stimulus to action, unless there is an actual and direct communication of a substantial force. Within brackets, substantial, as far as it appears in the usual sense of the word in this universe of illusion and Maya, of course, not so in reality. And further, this force may be the most refined and sublimated immaterial entity within brackets, question mark. Yet it must exist, for no sense, element, or faculty of the human being can have a perception or be stimulated into action without some substantial force coming in contact with it. This is the fundamental law pervading the whole organic and mental world. In the true philosophical sense, there is no such thing as independent action, for every force or substance is correlated to some other force or substance. We can, with just as much truth and reason, assert that no substance possesses any inherent gustatory property or any olfactory property, that taste and odor are simply sensations caused by vibrations, and hence mere illusions of animal perceptions. End of note. There is a transcendental set of causes put in motion, so to speak, in the occurrence of these phenomena, which, not being in relation to our narrow range of cognition, can only be traced to their source and their nature, and understood by the spiritual faculties of the adept. They are, as Asclepius puts it to the king, incorporeal corporealities, such as appear in the mirror and abstract forms that we see, hear, and smell in our dreams and visions. What have the modes of motion, light and ether, to do with these? Yet we see, hear, and smell, and touch them, Ergo, they are as much realities to us in our dreams as any other thing on this plane of Maya. Next chapter is chapter 11 on the elements and atoms, from the standpoint of science and that of occultism.